Building Blocks 2025 in Tel Aviv. The future of tech.
Hi, my name is Jonah Burian. I work at a fund called Blockchain Capital, and I was an engineer prior to this. I lived in Israel for a couple of years. I was a student here. I worked here. I ran a small engineering team in Tel Aviv. And I guess for those of you unaware of our investments, we're early investors in companies like Circle and Tether and Paxos and Anchorage. Companies like Aave, more recently leading rounds like Eigenlayer and WorldCoin. And the topic of this conversation is your product doesn't matter, which is a little bit of an edgy title, but we'll jump into it. So the motivation for the talk is that I see many pitches every single week, and there's been a problematic pitch I hear all the time, which is along the lines of, I have the best product in the world, it is better than my competitor's product because of whatever reasons, we're going to win. But the best product is just not good enough. Why? Because it misses the larger game. What is the go-to-market strategy? What is the vision? How do you attract customers? What are the barriers to entry? Are you positioned in the market to capture value? There's all these other questions that are super critical when building a company that's saying, I have the best product, we're going to win, build it, they will come. It doesn't work. So the structure for this talk is we're going to do two parts, theory and then practice. We're going to walk through the market for swaps, and specifically swaps on Solana. And we're going to talk about which players in the value chain actually make money and why. And what you'll see at the end of this talk is that positioning, owning your own distribution, all these other questions are as important, if not more important, than just details about your product. So again, this is one market structure. This is the market structure for swaps. Different markets look different, different supply chains look different. So as a result, I don't want you to take away from this talk, oh, every market looks like this, I want to be here because this is where you make money in swaps. I'm just giving you a particular example, but it's illustrative of the fact that positioning in a market matters. Owning the user matters. So the market for on-chain swaps. Well, high level, a user wants to swap token A for token B. They're willing to pay a fee. One of the big lessons from this past cycle is that users are particularly fee insensitive. They're willing to pay a fee as expressed as a couple of basis points of their trading volume. And there's multiple players in the supply chain. So when you do a swap, you pay a fee, and it gets split up amongst the front end, the DEX protocol, the back end, namely the blockchain. So the life cycle of a swap, this is a little bit illustrative, but high level, you have a user comes in via front end, so you can imagine the Uniswap front end, right? They initiate a swap there. That swap gets routed to a centralized exchange. You can imagine an AMM, an on-chain order book, or RFQ on-chain, and that gets settled on a blockchain. So each player in this stack is going to try to take a little bit of this fee. And obviously, users have choice. So in the case of Solana, for example, a user can come in via, Radium, or they can come in via Jupiter, right? So it's not like they have one option. Users have a choice, right? So people are competing over users, competing over the fees. And on top of that, there are blockchains competing, right? You have Solana, you have Ethereum, with different front ends, different DEXs, they're all competing. So how do front ends compete? Well, they're competing on loyalty, brand, UX, learned behaviors, all that. DEXs are competing over having the best price, the deepest liquidity, having the most security. And blockchains are competing over network effects and the interoperability benefits of having all the protocols be on your chain. They're competing over security, religion, which is another way of saying brand. But there's basically competition at different layers of the stack, and your goal is to stand out to make the most fees. So I'm now going to go through just a couple of the strategies that players in the space might choose high level, and then we're going to walk through an actual example of Solana later. So initially, you saw early verticalization. You saw the front end wanted to own the DEX that it was using. So a good example is Uniswap, right? They own the front end and they own the DEX, and there's a lot of benefits to this, because if you own the front end, now you own the user relationship, you own taker volume, and you can route it to your backend, to your exchange. This ensures flows going to your exchange. As a result, it incentivizes market makers, liquidity providers to come and quote prices. And on top of that, you have the benefit of you don't need to share fees with some external party. The front-end DEX can keep all the fees for itself, and the front-end doesn't need to be giving fees to some random DEX. So there's a lot of benefits of owning the distribution and then also the exchange. And as a side point, what you're now seeing is people are questioning, why even give fees to the blockchain? And now you're seeing complete verticalization. I think Uniswap with Unichain or Hyperliquid is a good example of this. And I think as an important side point, it is incredibly difficult, specifically in the on-chain world, to verticalize without owning the front end. So if you, say, just do a verticalization of the DEX and the blockchain, or you just own the DEX, it's a really hard place to sit as a business. Why? Well, why would anybody send valuable taker flow to you, right? And if no one's sending valuable flow, why would market makers come and price? And it's harder to get the flywheel running of having a deep exchange, right? So by not owning the user relationship, it's really hard to incentivize people to come. Mind you, traditional finance is a little bit different, where you have exchanges that are standalone, that do not own a front end, but because of how retail dominant the on-chain world is, it's a little bit different. So this is more about the market structure of on-chain swaps. But later on in the equation, right, you have this early verticalization, you have people trying to own different parts of the stack, you ended up getting an aggregator. And what was the aggregator, or what is an aggregator? An aggregator, the goal is to sit between a front end and the decentralized exchanges, and basically just route a order to the cheapest DEX price, right? So what is happening here? It actually disintermediates the DEX from the front end. Now the DEX sits farther from owning the user, and if you think about who benefits, well, the front end completely benefits. Why? Well, the aggregator puts commoditization pressure on the backends, on the decentralized exchanges, right? Because suddenly, decentralized exchanges need to compete over having the cheapest quote, right? So how much can you charge? Well, the delta between you and the next best exchange, right? So this puts complete pressure to lower fees, lower fees. Now, front ends benefit. Why? They don't even need to own the exchange, and yet they can benefit from the cheapest prices. And obviously, you'll only be using an aggregator if the aggregator is charging less than the exchange, which means the front end now gets to keep more of the fees. So notice that by the front end owning the user relationship, the front end is actually able to charge a fee because they are where the user enters the system from. Remember, we talked about users are a little bit fee insensitive. And the aggregator pushes the fees down of the exchanges. So now a front end doesn't even need to own an exchange, and yet can benefit from all the liquidity of the exchanges. But mind you, so we're talking about the front end and the DEX, the aggregator is a risky business to be in. And that is because front ends aren't necessarily loyal, right? Like you're pointing at one aggregator, you could point tomorrow at a different aggregator, right? Someone can come along, build it. It's a thin middleware layer, right? So it's not necessarily the best place to sit. There's arguments of you could add value-added services and all that, but because the aggregator doesn't own the user relationship, the front end has ball control. They control the distribution, and in some sense, they could kind of pick their winners. So what did you end up seeing? You saw, unsurprisingly, vertical integration of the front end and the aggregator. Why? Well, as a front end, now you have the benefit of commoditizing the DEXs. You don't even need to own the DEX. You don't need to manage liquidity, pay for the liquidity, no nothing, and yet you get the cheapest price. And right, this isn't an aggregator stam, right? Some Hebrew, but this is a aggregator for the sake of actually having a better front end. So now, zooming out, I want to go back to the previous slide. If you came and you pitched, I have the best decentralized exchange protocol, we're going to have the best way to quote prices, yada, 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 right? Like, and you don't own the front end and you have no response to the aggregator, that's not necessarily a good business. So you might have the best product, the best exchange, most interesting code, but the market forces at play, not being disintermediated from the front end, makes it really, really hard to be a good business. So notice here that the owning the user relationship matters tremendously here, right? So if you think about who makes money in the stack, right? If you own the user relationship as a front end, you own the user's touch point, right? You could charge a fee. Aggregator gets commoditized because they're competing with each other. DEXs get commoditized by the aggregator. All these middles get squeezed. And the blockchain, because everything's settling to it, right? There's some interoperability benefits. It has network effects. The liquidity lives on it, right? Wallets are kind of structured specifically for certain blockchains sometimes. But All this is to say the front end makes money, the blockchain makes money. Things in the middle get squeezed. So again, coming and pitching a company that sits in the middle without a good response to all these pressures in the market isn't necessarily a good company. So you can have the best aggregator, the best routing mechanism, but again, right, your product matters, but there's also the go-to-market, how do you own the user relationship, all these other questions. And just to go a little bit deeper into this market structure, what wallets noticed is, whoa, we are oftentimes the touch point of the user with the chain. We actually own the user relationship before they ever go to the front end. So why are we giving up all this amazing flow to these front ends? Let's just embed a swap button in the wallet. And that's precisely what wallets like Phantom, for example, do. I think that's an image from the Phantom wallet. So what wallets do is they're trying to pick off the user right before they go to the front end. And mind you, to the aggregation point before, they don't even need to own the exchanges to give a really good service because they can route through an aggregator. As a side point, an interesting question to this market structure is how do wallets as a service and how do embedded wallets affect this dynamic, right? It changes the relationship between a user and a wallet and where the wallet sits in terms of the supply chain. So now we have somewhat of a high-level understanding. We understand that coming and pitching the best DEX or the best aggregator is probably insufficient. There's more to the story than just having the perfect pricing algorithm, right? You need to own the user relationship or own the valuable state as a blockchain. And we're now going to run through a real example of Solana. We're going to see a high-level example of the Solana blockchain. Who are the players? And we're going to see who makes money. And we'll see it's exactly as we predicted from the first section. So Solana in practice. Mind you, I'm putting a handful of names just what can fit on the slide, but I try to pick something from like each category. So the biggest wallet on Solana is Phantom. You have front ends like Pump, right? Pump is more of a casino-looking feel. That's how it gets its users. You have Radium that looks more like a vanilla kind of AMM. Front end, you have Jupiter that has all these interesting value-added services on top, like DCA features and all these other stuff. And you have Dex Screener that's more of like a pro tail, has a lot more statistics and data, right? So for front ends, you have Jupiter, which actually owns its own aggregator. So remember that verticalization with the front end and the aggregator. And Jupiter has some business relationship with Meteora. I don't know if they own it or whatever, but there's some business relationship there. So there's actually a little bit of a deeper vertical integration. Jupiter's aggregator doesn't just route to its own DEX, it also routes to Radium's DEX, which is owned by Radium, and all this settles to Solana. So what should we expect? Well, we should expect, based on the previous conversation about owning the user relationship is so critical, that who should win? Well, the front ends and Solana. And mind you, if you go online and you look at fees, it's such a misleading statistic. And the reason for that is because oftentimes fees get paid to LPs. So it's not really a good metric for revenue. Looking at revenue is more important. So that being said, if you just go on to DeFi Llama and sort Solana protocols by revenue, what do you see? They're literally all front ends or Solana itself, exactly as we would have predicted, right? And many of these protocols don't even own the exchange, right? They're just the front end and they benefit from an aggregator. Right? So notice that someone pitching a Telegram bot, right? That's such an easy thing. It's not particularly sophisticated, no nothing. But notice that that business, which it isn't the best product necessarily, right, could make so much revenue. And the reason is because the owning of the user relationship, at least in this market structure, is so much more important than the features you have on some sort of exchange, right? Owning the user is so important here. So again, right, coming and pitching a OK Telegram bot with an amazing distribution strategy is in many ways a better pitch than a amazing DEX with a bad strategy of how they're not going to get disintermediated, right? So what I now want to show is that all the players in the stack are fully aware of this dynamic. And what we'll see is that they're all actually pivoting in order to kind of own more of the stack and do exactly the theories we began with. So remember, Pump did not own a DEX before. Now they just decided to, wait a second, why have we been routing all this valuable flow to Radium? Right? We can capture more of the fee. We actually have ball control. We own the user relationship. So what did Pump just do? They just announced, they actually just started it, they have their own DEX now. Right? They're not sharing fees with Radium. So now Radium just took a big hit. right? They had a big volume drop off. Why? Because net new tokens on Pump are trading through their own exchange, right, and not Radium. So by being disintermediated from the user, right, so from Radium not necessarily owning like Pump's volume, right, it was able to get disintermediated. Jupiter realizes the same thing. They're like, wait a second. Phantom sits higher than us on the stack as being a wallet. So what did they just announce? They're going to build a wallet, right? Duh. They want to own the user relationship more. What else did they realize? Well, Pump has an amazing distribution strategy of being this casino-like feel. Why don't we compete there? They just acquired Moonshot. And Moonshot, what is Moonshot? It's a Pump competitor, right? So now they're competing on a distribution layer. What else did Jupiter realize? Well, they own the aggregator, and they're routing a tremendous amount of flow to Radium. Why don't we begin trading the majors on our own exchange? So Jupiter just built an RFQ for trading the majors. You can look at Solana data, a lot of volume is being sent to this RFQ. So if you notice, all the people that own the user relationship are able to pivot and do things to kind of strengthen their own position at the expense of others. And the constant theme here is that those who own the user relationship have the most wiggle room in this market structure to do interesting things. So again, if you came to the Solana ecosystem and said, hey, look, I'm going to build the best DEX ever. It'll be better priced than Radium's DEX, a better price. It doesn't matter, right? You're going to be disintermediated. All the market forces at play are not set up for you to win. There's more to the story, right? So again, companies in the middle will get squeezed. And who actually wins here? Well, as we talked about in the previous couple slides, right, the front ends, and obviously Solana, because it's benefiting from all this activity that's sitting on top of it. So a side point, and I was a little bit misleading, there's another actor in the chain, which is MEV. And that value is captured kind of between the DEXs and the blockchain. In the example of Solana, that actor is Jito, and they make a lot of money as well. But I think for the sake of this talk, I left it out for just complexity's sake. Looking at the market structure of MEV on Ethereum is an interesting one, and they capture a lot of value too. But I think for a separate talk. But what I want the takeaways to be is, at least in swaps, owning the user relationship is critical. Why? It gives you ball control, right? Users are fee insensitive. You can quote a fee there. It allows you to commoditize layers below you. Second takeaway, if you come and you pitch, I have the best product without any understanding of how your distribution works or go to market or any of the other stuff, it's insufficient. And I guess point 3 is a little bit redundant, so I'm not going to go through it. So anyways, thank you so much for coming to the talk. I guess we have a couple minutes left for questions if anybody has. But thank you for having me.
Building Blocks 2025 in Tel Aviv.